All right, let's just jump right in, because something pretty wild just happened. It's the kind of thing you almost never see in American business. The US government itself just bought a huge chunk of a major tech company. And yeah, we're talking about Intel.
And listen, this wasn't some quiet, behind-the-scenes deal either. Nope, the news dropped like a bombshell with this post from President Trump. Just like that, he announces the United States is now a major owner in, one of the original foundational companies of Silicon Valley. You can bet that sent some serious shockwaves through the tech world and Wall Street.
So the actual number, when the dust settled, was 9.9%. Now, you might think, okay, that's not 51%. And you're right, it's not a controlling stake. But, and this is a big but, it's enough to make the US government the single largest investor in Intel. We're talking bigger than giants like Vanguard. That's a huge deal.
Which, of course, brings us to the big question, right? The whole reason we're doing this explainer. How in the world did we get to this point? How does a company that literally defined American tech power for decades end up needing a lifeline from the government? It's a crazy story. Let's get into it.
So to really get why this deal happened, you've got to understand the backstory. And the backstory is that Intel, the company that was the undisputed king of chips forever, has been in some serious trouble. And this wasn't an overnight thing. It was more like a slow-motion train wreck that eventually became a massive national security issue.
See, while Intel was stumbling, its competitors were just taking off. You had TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea they blew past everyone in advanced manufacturing, making the absolute best chips. And then, right here in the US, you've got NVIDIA and AMD completely owning the AI chip race, the stuff that's powering, everything now. So Intel was getting absolutely squeezed from every direction.
And internally? Oh, it was a full-blown crisis. They had this super ambitious plan, 5 nodes in 4 years, to try and catch up, and it just didn't work. That failure led to them burning through an incredible $45 billion in cash. Naturally, the market totally lost faith, the stock price just cratered, and the whole thing ended with, you guessed it, another CEO heading for the exit. The company was just bleeding out, both in terms of cash and credibility.
So a corporate crisis like that, it didn't take long to become a political one. And when it did, things moved at lightning speed. Look at this timeline. On August 7th, the president is on social media calling for the CEO's job. Just 4 days later, they're meeting at the White House and talking about solutions. And by Friday of that same week, boom, the deal is announced. The sheer speed of it all just shows you how intense that political pressure really was.
Okay, so let's talk about the deal itself. This government lifeline. What did it actually involve? Where did the nearly $9 billion come from? Was this, a classic taxpayer bailout where the government just prints a check?
Well, the answer is kind of complicated. The money actually came from the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. Now, you probably remember this. It was a huge bipartisan law meant to hand out grants, basically free money, to get companies to build chip factories here in America. But here's the key thing. The original law said nothing about the government taking ownership. That's the part that makes this whole thing a totally new playbook.
And here's exactly how they did it. The government basically took the money Intel was already in line to get from the CHIPS Act and another military program, and instead of just handing it over as a grant, they said, we're going to take that money and buy stock with it instead. So that's what the president meant when he said the U.S. paid nothing for the shares. No new check was written. They just converted money that was already promised into an ownership stake.
The structure of this deal is actually really interesting when you dig into it. First, the government gets the shares, but they promise to be a passive investor. That means they'll just vote along with whatever the board recommends, so they're not trying to run the company day to day. But, and this is a big one, there's a little something for the future. The US gets these things called warrants, which are basically the right to buy even more stock down the road if Intel ever tries to sell off a majority of its manufacturing business. Think of it as a built-in insurance policy.
So as you can probably imagine, a move this big, this unprecedented, it kicked off a massive debate. On one side, people are calling it a genius move to save a vital national asset. On the other, they're saying it's a really dangerous step, with the government starting to pick winners and losers in the free market.
And the arguments really do fall into two very clear camps. The folks who are for it say, look, this secures a critical part of our tech supply chain, it gives Intel the stability it needs to turn itself around, and hey, if the stock recovers, the taxpayers could even make a profit. But the critics are sounding the alarm. They're saying, hold on, money doesn't fix the real problem here, which is execution. This sets a dangerous precedent, and it risks turning a private company into a political tool.
Here's the official line, straight from Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. The administration is pitching this almost entirely as a matter of national and economic security. They're saying this is what we have to do to win the global tech race, especially when it comes to AI.
But then you hear from the other side, from experts like Paul Argenti. And his whole point is that, historically, the government doesn't have a great track record with this stuff. It's a huge gamble. If Intel actually manages a comeback, then yeah, it looks like a genius move. But if it doesn't, it's just a huge, very expensive lesson in government overreach, and the taxpayers are left holding the bag.
And if you look at history, you can see he's got a point. Both outcomes have happened before. Remember the AIG bailout in 2008? That actually made a $23 billion profit for taxpayers. But then you have the auto bailouts, which lost about $10 billion. And then there's Amtrak, which has basically been subsidized for half a century and has never made a profit. So yeah, there is absolutely no guarantee this will work out.
And I think this quote from Bernstein analyst Stacy Rascon really hits the nail on the head for the critics. He says their problem, Intel's problem, it hasn't really been about a lack of dollars. It's been about a lack of capability. They just haven't been able to execute their plans. And that's something, as he points out, that government money can't fix. Intel is going to have to prove they can do that all by themselves.
All right, so let's pull back for a second and look at the bigger picture. Is this Intel deal just a one-time crazy thing, or is it a sign of a much bigger shift in how the US government thinks about its role in really important industries?
Because when you start looking around at other things that have happened recently, you start to see a pattern. The government took a stake in a rare earth metals company. It secured what's called a golden share in the US steel takeover. Suddenly, the Intel deal doesn't look like it's happening in a vacuum, right? It feels like the biggest, most high-profile example of a new, much more hands-on approach from Washington.
And really, that's the big takeaway here. For decades, the American philosophy was basically hands-off when it came to private business. It looks like that era might be over. In these industries that are seen as critical for national security, whether it's steel, rare earth metals, or now microchips, that old, clear line between the public and private sectors is getting really, really blurry.
And that leaves us with one final, really important question to think about. In this global race for tech supremacy, especially with countries like China, pretty much everyone agrees that some government support for key industries is needed. But where is the line? At what point does support become risky control, the kind of control that could actually hurt innovation and inject politics into our economy? The Intel deal hasn't answered that question. In fact, it's put it right on the front page for all of us to grapple with.